Flannery O'Connor, one of America's greatest fiction writers and strongest champions for the Roman Catholic Church in the 20th century, was a devout believer whose small but impressive body of fiction presents the soul's struggle with what she called the stinking maid shadow of Jesus. The publication of her first short story collection, A Good Man is Hard to Find, in 1955, made O'Connor's Christian vision and darkly comic intent very clear. Her work resists conventional description, and the triumph of her writing lies in between the balance of the realistic and the anagogical. She was a painstaking and disciplined writer, devoting each morning to her work and persisting on excellence even in her last years as she struggled with lupus. She possessed a keen ear for Southern dialect and a fine sense of irony and comic timing. It is by the combination of these skills that she produced some of the finest comedy in American literature. O'Connor's dark humor consciously intends to highlight our human sinfulness and need for divine grace. To fully understand A Good Man is Hard to Find, one must first understand Flannery O'Connor, her belief system, and essential points in her biography. The manner in which this presentation is conducted will give the audience a greater insight into the mind of Flannery O'Connor, thus furthering the reader's ability to understand the deeply complex short story A Good Man is Hard to Find. In this presentation, Flannery O'Connor will open letters from aspiring writers and admiring readers who sought answers to some interesting questions. Why letters? O'Connor responded to almost every letter that was sent to her, regardless of its nature. This was her way of staying in touch with the world around her as she dwindled away with her battle against lupus. The chair on which she will sit is one that does not have arms. This speaks to Flannery's diligence. She devoted her mornings to writing and expected each minute to be fruitful. A chair with arms encouraged a relaxed attitude. The bookshelf behind her is what she would face every morning as she wrote. Why face a bookshelf as opposed to your window, which overlooked the beautiful family farm in Andalusia? She believed that facing a bookshelf would keep her from any distraction. Therefore, she could focus solely on her writing. The Bible, the Book of Catholic Catechism, and the statue of St. Joseph and Jesus reminds the audience of O'Connor's devout religious nature and are items that were on her shelf in her room. The bird, the peacock, in the picture frame behind me was important to O'Connor because it symbolized her, gawky and comic. It also served as a symbol during the Middle Ages of Christ and the Church. Therefore, she kept a picture of the peacock on her bookshelf, just as I kept one behind me. Flannery O'Connor did not like narrow-minded people and grew bored with the mundaneness of everyday activities. She would have considered responding to letters that only dealt with a specific topic, such as writing, style, or biography, as a chore. Therefore, the questions that will follow cover a broad range of topics, such as biography, writing style, preferences, and religion. What's the difference between a Christian novelist and a naturalistic one? Debbie from Ohio writes, Dear Debbie, the novelist is required to create the illusion of a whole world with believable people in it, and the chief difference between the novelist who is an Orthodox Christian, such as myself, and the novelist who is merely a naturalist is that the Christian novelist lives in a larger universe. He, as do I, believes that the natural world contains the supernatural, and this doesn't mean that his obligation is to portray the natural as less, but it simply means that it's greater. Should novelists avert their eyes from what is bad? The novelist is required to open his eyes on the world around him and look. If what he sees is not highly edifying, he is still required to look. What he sees at all times is fallen man perverted by false philosophies. Is he to reproduce this? Or is he to change what he thinks and make it, instead of what it is, what it ought to be in faith and in the light of faith, to tidy up reality? That is the question I beg of you. Thanks for writing. Flannery. How did living in the South affect you personally? To be quite honest with you, when I moved back to Georgia from Iowa in 1950, I feared that perhaps my return would mark my death of my creative life. But living at home was the best thing that's happened to me thus far. While I've spent my mornings writing, my mother has attended to the complex, practical affairs of family life. We've become indispensable to each other, and even though she has tested her innocence and simplicity of her piety has tested me, I love her dearly. Therefore, it is never the narrow-minded parents who are the villains in my fiction, but the brilliant sons and daughters who held them in contempt. The South also provided me with a sharp sense of identity. It was the Civil War-laden and Christ-haunted. This, in a sense, served both as a spur and a rein on my imagination. Because of where I've grown up and where I live presently, I never have to make my characters or interesting situations from scratch. It's all around me. Your work is often described as shockingly violent. Really? What does a reader need to take into consideration while reading your work? Well, the force behind the violence is definitely not intended to make one squirm with discomfort, but to shock the reader into acts of radical spiritual self-recognition, so too that we can see ourselves both as terribly as we are and as hopefully what we might become. This is the effect that the awful violence has on my characters. It makes the blind see and the deaf hear. Remember that while a lot of people get killed in my stories, nobody gets hurt. Thanks for writing in. I enjoyed the questions. Flannery. Wow, what a far way away. Someone from Oregon writes, starting in high school, you began drawing cartoons. Why? Dear June, when asked to contribute to the high school newspaper, I told the editor, I can't write, but I can draw. That was a big mistake. But since then, I've always emphasized the important relationship between the visual arts and writing. My imagery is a bridge between the visual arts and writing. It's my hope that the readers view my words as a paintbrush which paints a beautiful picture. Why do so many writers fail? As I reflect, this question definitely carries a certain truth to it. Many writers do fail. And I don't think it's because they're bad writers, but more simply because they just don't understand what a story is. A story isn't about telling the reader. A story is about showing the reader. A successful writer must first learn how to become a graphic artist, like the caricaturist who uses exaggeration and distortion in order to emphasize the character of his subject. I tried to create bizarre characters of extreme situations in order to achieve deeper kinds of realism. Cartooning in high school opened my eyes to the possibility of combining the comic and serious elements together to create a unique and true vision of reality. Do you believe that the Iowa Writers' Workshop helped you learn how to write? Most certainly. When I went there, I didn't know a short story from a newspaper ad. I wouldn't say that they taught me how to write, but they definitely gave me that initial push that a writer needs to discover that she can and wants to write. I also learned perhaps my greatest lesson there, and it is with you that I confide it to. A writer operates at a peculiar crossroad where time, place, and eternity somehow meet. My job as a writer is to find that location. For me, this crossroad is at the mercy of the angel of death. That is why I feel I describe death scenes in such graphic detail. What makes a story work? What makes a story work? Dear Scarlett, what makes a story work is some action or gesture of a character, which was both totally right and totally unexpected. It would have to be one that was both in character and beyond character. For this, you can refer to the grandmother in A Good Man is Hard to Find. It was completely beyond her character at the end when she began to speak to the misfit and tell him that he could be one of her sons. Can you explain your reasonable use of the unreasonable? About this, I can only say that there are perhaps other ways than my own in which the story could be read, but none other by which it could have been written. Belief in my own case, anyway, is the engine that makes perception operate. What are your thoughts on character development? I've never really had to put this down on paper. Most stories don't go inside a character, don't reveal very much of character. I don't mean that they don't enter the character's mind, but they simply don't show that he has a personality. These characters have no distinctive speech to reveal themselves with, and sometimes they have no really distinctive features. You feel at the end of the story they have no personality, because no personality is revealed. If you start out with a real personality, a real character, then something is bound to happen. And if you don't know what to do before you begin, it might be better. You ought to be able to discover something from your stories. Besides, if you can't discover something, who else will? What are the two things you believe a writer must have when writing fiction? When you write fiction, you're speaking with character and action, not about character and action. The writer's moral sense must coincide with his dramatic sense. Therefore, the two things a writer must have when writing fiction is a dramatic sense and a moral sense. Which characters do you expect the readers to have pity on? What an interesting question. Self-knowledge can be a curse, and indeed it is the characters that are allowed to live that should be more pitied, because they are confronted with the unbearable truth of their own folly, their own pathetic, wasted lives, which they can no longer deny, such as the misfit in A Good Man is Hard to Find. Likewise, though, the grandmother, self-centered as she may be, is completely unaware spiritually. The epiphany that I provided her with was one that she would probably she does not have to deal with now that her life has been spared and she was killed. Therefore, it is not the grandmother who should be pitied, but rather the misfit. Oh, excuse me, Scarlett. I did not mean that the grandmother should not be life was spared, but she was killed. But she was spared from living with a life of such an epiphany. What a dreadful life that would be. What is the subject behind your fiction? The action of grace and territory held largely by the devil. I've always found that what I write is read by an audience which puts little stock in either grace or the devil. Who were your chief influences? I am forever indebted to the great modem masters, especially Joseph Conrad, William Faulkner, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and Henry James. The slapdash, knee-slapping humor of Mark Twain was spellbinding to me, but as a child I was obsessed with the poetry of Edgar Allan Poe. Poe's emphasis on the bizarre and the macabre shaped my love for the grotesque. Later on, reading the works of French writers, Georges Bernanos and Francis Marillac, reinforced my emphasis on original sin, guilt, and alienation. Last letter of the day. Which one of your characters embodies you the most? I wouldn't say a particular character embodies me the most, as they all do pretty equally, but if I was to pick one in particular, I would say the misfit. It's through this character that I artistically confess my own regret that life had not been so fair. How do you describe your fiction? It'll always be pushing its own limits outward toward the limits of mystery.